And we are back, ladies and gentlemen. This time we felt important that we look into a module that we call political tolerance. It is important that, from the get-go, I explained the importance of why we thought let us include political tolerance as one of the modules. Now, over the years of working with a number of student organizations, and of course with the advent of political organizations within campuses, is that we are finding that students over the years have struggled with, if you like, sharing power, and sharing power purely because they are intolerant of one another. And when we try to really hone in on what the causes of this intolerance is, and we have found it's purely because of different political organizations have very different political dogmas, and on the basis of those different political dogmas, they tend to be very, very intolerant of one another. Now, this intolerance is not helping anyone. It's not helping the individual student leaders. It's not helping the students that they serve, and certainly not helping the institutions that they lead. And so the importance of beginning to have conversations around political tolerance. How do we get student leaders to share, to be tolerant of one another on campus? And so this module is really going to delve into such things as, what is this political tolerance that we speak of? And then what is the difference between political tolerance and political intolerance? Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to also look at, in this module, we're going to look at how different political ideologies then form, and not only just form, and how they influence the levels of tolerance in institutions. But you will also notice as we go along that we will begin to speak about such concepts as populism. We'll talk about how mobilization. But in the end, we want to be able to locate the role of tolerance in a democratic theory. So that then forms the framework of this module that is coming up next. Political tolerance, in its very sort of naked sense, in its very simplest of sense, just means you are able to accept and respect the basic rights and civil liberties of persons or people that hold different viewpoints from your own. Meaning, you begin to realize that political party X has got a totally different viewpoint from political party Y. And in itself, there's nothing wrong with the different political viewpoints, which is where now political tolerance comes in. Political tolerance teaches us the ability to be able to accept and respect those different viewpoints. And so, as we present this to student leaders, we are trying to make the point that it is going to require a lot of political tolerance on your part to be able to function as a structure. More so because the nature of our party political system then pits the different members of the different political parties into one structure, where you could find, I'm loath to make mention of the specific political parties, but we do know that different political parties would exist together in one structure. Political tolerance then says to us, if you have political tolerance, then you are able to respect and to accept the other people's different viewpoints. To the extent that we believe that as student leaders, and in fact, we'll go on to say all leaders, political leaders, have a responsibility to practice political tolerance. And this practice of political tolerance, we want to see it in the words that you use, in the language that you use, and we want to see it in the actions that you then employ as you conduct yourself as a leader. So there must be a clear rejection of might makes right, as opposed to political tolerance being a key principle of democracy, right? So where we believe in might makes right is where we believe the one with more power, the one with more votes, has got the right to dictate the terms of the SRC. In actual fact, it should be the other way around. It is in understanding and appreciating the level of power that you have within a structure, that you then you're able to use it in a more mature way. And the only way to be able to do that is if you are politically tolerant. But we speak about this political tolerance within the realm of democracy. What is this democracy, right? As an ideal, democracy upholds that different members of society should, at the very least, as a basic principle, treat each other and be treated as equals, regardless of their seniority or minority status. Underlying democracy is the acceptance and the respect for one another. Democratic life is both the right to differ as well as the acceptance of such differences by all. Right? And this is a point that is very important that you make, is that democracy allows us the right to differ, to hold different political viewpoints, but tolerance then comes and says, it is in those differences that you begin to accept those differences, you begin to respect the differences. Because in the absence of doing that, then you have a very dysfunctional society, you have a very dysfunctional university, you have a very dysfunctional SRC structure. Democracy implies respect for the plurality of views and the virtues of dialogue as a means of resolving conflicts. There are those who speak about, those political theorists, political scientists who speak about what they call the marketplace. You turn the SRC into a marketplace of ideas. A marketplace of ideas is understanding. You don't have a herd mentality. We don't all believe in the same thing. But it is in those very different views that we bring them all together in some sort of a parliament where each view is expressed, each view is treated with respect, each view is accorded its own platform. And we do this not because we want to be the same, but because we realize that it is in our divergence that lies our strengths. Political intolerance, on the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, it will always happen in an institution, in a university, or in a society where there is the willingness to restrict the right of disliked persons. So meaning we identify groups, individuals in society that we dislike for whatever our reasons, and upon disliking them, we then say whatever their rights, they become restricted, purely because we have disliked them. And that is when you are creating an environment where intolerance takes root in your society. What it does is that it represents a threat to democracy, right? Since you have numbers or individuals or groups in that society that are discriminated against, to the extent that you discriminate against them, where you even have to silence them, that you mute their ideas, you mute their voices. The problem with intolerance, ladies and gentlemen, is that it creates a conformist culture where everybody just wants to conform just because. So it is not informed by anything that is sensical, but purely because I do not want to be silenced, therefore I must become a conformist. That is a problem with intolerance. The idea of silencing others is purely based on the fact that they offer ideologies totally different from the ideologies that we hold sacred. But what is this ideology? Perhaps maybe let's look at a little bit into the idea of political ideology in particular, as held by student leaders, informed by the dogmas of their political parties. Ideology is a collection of beliefs held by you as a structure or as a society or a group of people. It is mainly made up of a set of very conscious and very unconscious ideas about what makes up one's beliefs, what leads to one's goals, the expectations that you have of yourself, and the motivations that drive you to want to serve students. So it's important that student leaders are very aware of their conscious and unconscious ideas about what they hold to be true. We always make the point that, particularly if you follow our work on conflict management, that people's perceptions are their realities. But those realities are based on very, very falsehoods. It is important that we, as an individual, as a group, you begin to question your very conscious and unconscious ideas about your ideologies. Ideology is the imaginary relation to the real conditions of existence. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but I think the key word here is this imaginary. It is what you hold to be true in your head. And what you hold to be true in your head, if supported by a narrative by other people around you, you make it to become your reality. But all is always been said and done. It's just an imagination. It's about what you as a group hold to be true. But in actual fact, it's not necessarily always the case. So ideology is formed really around those conscious and unconscious ideas about the beliefs that we have of the world. Now, couple ideology with this concept called populism. A number of leaders, I'm sure that as student leaders, you would be aware of a number of leaders in our country, in our continent, and the world, who you would very easily call populist leaders. Right? These are these are leaders who believe that their political stances are emphasized by the idea of the people. Now, as soon as somebody says for the people, of the people, what they are often is trying to suggest to all of us is that there is always the other group, which is the elite, considered to be the elite. Now, when populist leaders are very good at mobilizing voters or voting on the grounds of being the leaders of the people. And we make the point that as soon as you hear a leader say that, you must know that they're trying to pit one group of people against another, the people against the elite. A common framework, this is now trying to interpret populism. A common framework suggests that populism as an ideology presents the people, which is what this leader stands for, the people as a morally good force, and contrasts them against the elite, who are portrayed as corrupt or self-serving. Populists differ in how the people are defined, but it can be based along class. They use national lines, they use racial lines, they use ethnic lines to identify these people. So they segment people for their own benefit, if you like. And what these populist parties do and social movements do is that often they are led by very charismatic or dominant leaders or dominant figures who have a way, an ability of presenting themselves as the voice of the people. And as soon as you hear those words, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to learn that it is usually traces of populism. Be careful of those very charismatic and very dominant leaders who lead some of these political parties, who could very well, in fact, exist within our very universities, and in particular, UNISA. It is important that within that understanding, trying to explain this concept, ladies and gentlemen, that we make mention of the concept called mobilization. Mobilization is really about how these very populist leaders, or any populist leader, go about garnering votes for themselves or for their organizations. Now, in this module that we have put together, we make mention of three forms of political mobilizations. This is what we have now come to be accustomed to, particularly in a country such as ours, South Africa. Is that mobilization usually happens on three levels. Number one, it could happen at a level of, we use a populist leader. I don't know how many times have I seen during the elections, national elections, provincial elections in our country, where there's one particular face of a leader from one particular party that is used to sell the organization for the benefit of garnering votes. So the posters of that political party will feature only one member of that organization, one leader. In fact, in one organization I saw in the last elections, one political party used the face of a leader who passed away, just to make the point that because the leader was so popular, they still needed the popularity of that leader to garner the votes for their party. Sometimes what they do in mobilizing, ladies and gentlemen, is so in the one hand you could use a populist leader, on the other you could use ideology. Some organizations have used Africanism as an ideology. Some have used communism as an ideology, socialism as an ideology, and there's quite a number of them. Conservatism as an ideology. But in the end, it could also use social movement as a tool for mobilizing your vote. A social movement is identifying what the issues are on the ground, such as what you have in our country with the disbursement of food parcels during elections. That is really to get people to, it's a social movement in the sense that it solves a real and an existing problem on the ground, but we also do know that it is a way of garnering the votes. A catalyst for the growth of populism, we have found, is when leaders sell themselves as the ones who are going to solve all problems, because the leaders who are currently in office are unresponsive to the challenges of the people. So this is the mantra that we hear all the time from all leaders when it's time for elections. We are being promised all manner of things, with the suggestion that those who are currently in power have not been responding to our challenges, and those who come into power are now going to be our saviors. Now, let's bring this conversation back home to the SRCs. The experience that we have over the years picked up is that a lot of SRC members who come into power, they have a belief that as soon as they come into power, they assume office, they're going to solve all of the institution's problems. And we know that that is never the case. This is just the mantra to win votes. And as soon as you win votes, and to be fair to student leaders, as soon as you win votes, you get into the office of the SRC, then you realize that serving at that level is totally different from serving outside of the structures of the university. And this is the point where we always make the point that there is a huge difference between student activism and student representation. Now, while student activism might have gotten you the votes to get into the SRC office, it is not student activism that is going to keep you in office, because in the title of Student Representative Council, it means you are now a representative, meaning you are part of the governance structures of the institution. So no longer are you going to be banging down the doors, because the door is already open for you. And you need to be able to make that transition as a student leader, is making the transition from student activist to student representative. A lot of student leaders, we find, they only make that realization towards the end of their term in office, and at that time it's already too late. You've had a number of months in office where you try to grapple with the realities of being an SRC member, but you did it at the expense of being a student activist. So it's important that in the process of trying to mobilize, you're mobilizing so that you get into the SRC. When you get into the SRC, the game changes and the demands are a bit different, and so you need to be responsive to the new demands. Now the role of tolerance in a democratic theory. In its simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, democracy suggests that majority rules, right? And so it should be. Majority should rule. But the democracy is also a system in which respect for the rights of political minorities should also take center stage. And again, we will always go back to mature leadership. We'll always go back to discerning leadership. We'll always go back to the big picture kind of leadership, where you realize that even when you do have power, there will be those who will be minorities. And then it is in your ability to protect the rights of those minorities that will determine the kind of leader and the kind of leadership that you become. The one reality that student leaders are now confronted with, and this is we are beginning to realize now, is that we've got students who come from other African countries who come and study in our country, and they become our constituencies because they vote as well during elections. So they become a minority that needs to be protected by the SRC. You also have the persons from the LGBTQIA plus communities that need to be taken into consideration, that because of their numbers, they are lesser in numbers in a number of our campuses, it makes them minorities. And therefore, the SRC at some point needs to begin to champion some of their issues. A case in point that I found extremely interesting was around one university that spoke about what they did is that they reimagined their positions within the SRC, and rather than having portfolio of sports and recreation and portfolio of social this and that, they've got what they call universal access. Now, universal access then begins to suggest that they are very clear about protecting the rights of the minorities within campuses, such as your LGBTQIA+, such as your international students, particularly students from the African continent. And then, of course, there's issues, students such as persons with disabilities, students with disabilities, is that at some point or the other, somebody's going to have to take care of their needs. So, as a democratic theory suggests that you have the majority, but maturity on your part will then mean being able to protect your minorities. I spoke earlier on about creating the SRC into a marketplace of ideas. A marketplace of ideas is where you literally intentionally create spaces for all of these minorities to have a voice in the running of the institution, in the running of the SRC. So what we then do is that what we suggest that you do is that you set up institutions of majority rule. Now, these institutions of majority rule are not necessarily based on the numbers, but they are really based on ensuring a collectivism of all students involved in voicing whatever their issues, whether you do it via a mass meeting of students, whether you do it via a parliament of students, but there's got to be a way in which the minorities' rights are protected. Now, without guarantees of the right of all these minorities participating in the politics of the institution, you can forget about it becoming the marketplace of ideas, right? So if all that we do is the SRC is to listen to the voices of those who have got more power, those who have got more the numbers in terms of the votes, then we lose out those who are outside, who are on the periphery, where we cannot begin to speak about the marketplace of ideas, of the SRC as the marketplace of ideas. A marketplace of ideas, ladies and gentlemen, suggests that anybody can put forth an idea, and these ideas can then formulate what you call the program of action of the SRC. It means just before you undertake your processes of developing programs of action, it would perhaps be better for student leaders to go back to the masses, to the students, and say, what are your opinions, what are your ideas about the sort of programs that you'd like to see on campuses? When all has been said and done, and this is very important that we raise this issue, is that the programs that you come up with as the SRC, yes, you would have canvassed your student body, but they've got to be the kinds of programs that are empowering to students and that can engage students, right? Those two concepts are very important because they're important for the process of graduating students, right? When all has been said and done, these students come here because they want to get a qualification, they want to graduate. Now the manner in which they're going to graduate will be determined by the quality of life that they experience throughout their study years, and the SRC plays a critical role in that discourse. A fairly simple theory is that democracies require free and open debate of political differences, right? At any given point, where as an individual or as a grouping, whatever your political party, whatever you call yourselves, you feel threatened by ideas from a different political parties, what you need to know is that you are not fit for purpose, you're not ready for the maturity required to become SRC members. Because again, simple theory of democracy says to us, you've got to have free and open debate, whether it is we do it face-to-face, whether we do it in a meeting, whether we write, we publish articles, however way that we do it, but there's got to be the willingness to be open to free and open debate across the different political parties. Now, such debates can only take place in an environment where there is political tolerance. Now, political tolerance requires that all the ideas get the same access to the marketplace of ideas. Now, to retrace our steps, we speak a lot about political tolerance and we speak a lot about political intolerance. And of course, what we do know is that we want to get to a point where we are tolerant as a society or as an institution. Perhaps the question that we need to be asking is, what makes people intolerant? right? We found that this intolerance happens largely because, again, leaders who fail to see the big picture. 2, leaders who remain immature. 3, leaders who fail to make the transition from student activism to student representative. Now, this is a matter that I think, as the SRC of UNISA, we need to begin to, literally throughout the term of office, to engage in some of these issues. To what extent are we tolerant as a structure of this SRC? Measuring political tolerance. Now, tolerance requires that student leaders, you are able to accept ideas, even those that you find objectionable, even those that you find repulsive. You develop the maturity to accept and listen. As one leader once said, that I disagree with you, but I will protect your right to state your case, however repulsive I find it. I believe it was the late Bishop Desmond Tutu. This leads to pertinent questions. Which ideas must be put up with in an institution? Or put differently, what kinds of activities should we pursue as the SRC of a university such as UNISA? With the numbers that you deal with, the diversity that you deal with, what sort of activities should be embraced? What sort of ideas should be embraced? And only you, the leaders of this institution, can answer that question. But to answer this question, you're going to have to mobilize the entire student body around a discussion on what becomes a functioning institution for us. It is about identifying a group that you dislike and still put up with. It is about pluralistic intolerance, achieving consensus on who the enemy is. If that consensus cannot be reached, it means we don't actually dislike them. And there's a point being made here is that sometimes what you call dislike in another person is really just misunderstanding of the difference that they present to you. And if you could understand the difference, maybe we'll get to a point where we accept each other and there will be no more the disliking of others. What causes tolerance and what causes intolerance? Again, let's go back to that question. To answer this, focus must be on the individual. I spoke earlier on about what we call political dogma. It is people believing on what they believe on the basis of it is generally widespread, a widespread notion held by a number of people. But if we hone in on the individual student leader and we ask that person, what as an individual do you perceive to be a threat? Because we know that predictors of intolerance, ladies and gentlemen, include such things such as social esteem, self-esteem, my apologies. It is your self-esteem that is on the line. We also know that it includes such things as social learning, the manner in which you are socialized. It includes democratic values, those values that you hold dear to you. It includes your psychological insecurity, and largely it includes your personality traits. So the point that we're trying to make here is that maybe rather than aggregating the problem, let us disaggregate it and look at the individual, consider the individual. And when you look at the individual, as I said, let's look at their self-esteem, let's look at their social learning, let's look at their democratic values, let's look at their psychological insecurity, let's look at their personality traits. Looking at that put together will tell us a lot about the individual and how that individual influences those individuals, those others around them. We know that close-mindedness and psychological rigidity are also causes of intolerance. Is that you have such a limited worldview, you're very rigid in your psychological makeup that you are not able to see beyond the lenses that form your understanding of the world. And because of that, your intolerance then spikes because, again, you lack the big picture thinking that I speak of. But the strongest of all of these, ladies and gentlemen, around tolerance and intolerance, the strongest of them all is this thing called perceptions. Now, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'll go back and say people's perceptions are their realities, and I accept that. But I've also come to learn that it is those very perceptions that are based on falsehoods. Somebody once said, the problem with trying to express everybody's worldview is that sometimes people without a view of the world are allowed to express a worldview. Those who are threatened by their political enemy are less likely to tolerate them, and I suppose that goes without saying. While threat perceptions cause intolerance, it may also be the case that intolerance causes threat perceptions. So one feeds off each other. So what are we saying here? We're saying it is important that we understand the causes of tolerance and intolerance. But in order for us to be able to do that, perhaps let us look at the individual and not so much the whole as a collective. Maybe understanding the individual will help us understand the whole. And understanding the whole will help us understand the beliefs that they hold. And understanding their beliefs will understand why they become tolerant or intolerant of views that are different from their own. Environmental conditions have a way of exacerbating the problem, right? Or sometimes ameliorating the problem. By environmental conditions, we talk about such things as to the level to which our student leaders are exposed. How big is your world? What have you been exposed to? What have you been socialized to? We're finding that, and there's a thinker who makes the point around read and read and read as student leaders, right? We have problems of student leaders who all that you read is what you were fed by either your field of study or by your political party. But we would like a situation where student leaders are able to broaden their horizon, to read as widely as they possibly can, because it is in reading that your world becomes a little bit bigger. Right? And that goes with your environmental conditioning. What is important for us is understanding that these environmental conditions have the ability to either make the problem worse or reduce the problem. We also need to look at such things as what we call core values, core attitudes of people, and just how failure resistant they are to change, right? And failure resistant to change. If you want to be able to embrace the change from those core values and core attitudes, it is perhaps again a bit better to expose yourself to the bigger world. Realize that there's more to the world than just your personal beliefs. Here's some sobering thoughts. Right? Here's some sobering thoughts, perhaps as I begin to taper down, is that the tolerance is a difficult and cognitively demanding position to adopt. Tolerance requires deliberation. When people take the time and energy to deliberate, they often can discern the cost of intolerance. And I think for me, this is the important. Until such time, student leaders begin to realize the cost of intolerance on themselves, on their structures, on the students that they lead, on the institutions that they lead, they will perhaps begin to move towards tolerance. Tolerance is considered more pliable than intolerance. The tolerant can be more readily persuaded to abandon their tolerance than can the intolerant be convinced to become tolerant. Again, a bit of a mouthful, but what it says, and I'd like to repeat, the tolerant can be more readily persuaded to abandon their tolerance than the intolerant can be convinced to become tolerant. Meaning, people who are intolerant find it very difficult to move towards tolerance. And that is the challenge that society sits with today, is that people who are intolerant are very difficult to convince to become tolerant. Whereas people who are tolerant very easily can abandon their tolerance. And that for us, ladies and gentlemen, is a challenge that society has. And certainly as student leaders, it will have to be a challenge that you take up. First with yourselves as individuals, and of course, with the larger group. In closing, and this is perhaps something for student leaders to begin to think about, these are questions that I will ask, but there will be rhetoric questions. Can you think of, as a student leader, can you think of any case studies of political intolerance in the world, anywhere in the world? Take your time to think about it. Can you think about it? I don't want to be prescriptive, but from the African continent to the Middle East to Europe, to the Eastern Europe today. Another one to think about is, can you think about examples of political ideas in South Africa, political ideologies in our country? Right? This is something that, as you think about, you must think about it in relation to your own ideologies and the ideologies that you pursue. How do political parties in our country, in particular in our country, mobilize voters? What are the things that get students voting for you? And this is something that I was thinking about, in fact, just this weekend, is that to a very large extent, students vote. If a student votes for a particular party outside of campus, and that party then exists within their campus, they are highly likely to vote for that party, even though the demands are a little different. But there's this affinity that we find with our political parties, that we do not lose those parties, we do not divorce our parties. Doesn't matter where we find ourselves. So as student leaders, I think it's important that you begin to think about how, as you mobilize students, what is your sell? What is it that you're offering them versus what they get outside of their campuses? As you think about your term of office as student leaders, think about sections of the UNISA community that you would call minorities, right? How do you define them? How do we define minorities? Is it on the basis of the numbers? Is it on the basis of the lack of voice? Is it on the basis of their emerging? But who would you consider the sections of communities of this institution that you would consider minorities? Because understanding that, then the challenge becomes, how do you then get them to become part of this marketplace of ideas, right? How do you mobilize them to come and join in the table of ideas? Because, as I said, the more powerful that you are as a structure, whether you are national SRC, whether you are regional SRC, is that you hold a level of power that has got the ability to draw in the other minorities onto the table of of ideas, right? So it's important that you are able to protect the rights of your minorities. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to come to an end and thank you. Good luck.